It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in Oakwood Hills. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where kids loved to play outside. You could hear their happy shouts and see them running around. Neighbors usually smiled and waved at each other from their yards. Well, most of them did. But this day? Oh, it was about to get wild. 8-year-old Timmy Parker was the star of the show. He had a shiny red tricycle that sparkled in the sun. Timmy pedaled fast, zooming up and down the sidewalk, giggling like it was the best day of his whole life. His little legs pumped hard, and the wheels made a fun whirring sound. He was having a blast, and who could blame him? The weather was perfect: blue sky, warm air, and not a cloud anywhere. Timmy's mom, Sarah, sat on the front porch of their house. She had a big smile on her face, watching her son play. She sipped a glass of lemonade and waved at Timmy every time he zipped by. Everything felt just right, like a happy little picture. But then, someone crashed the party. You know how some people just love to make trouble? That was Linda Grayson. She was the president of the HOA, which stands for Homeowners Association. That's a group of people who make rules for the neighborhood, like no loud music or no painting your house crazy colors. Linda took her job way too seriously. She marched down the street toward Sarah's house, holding her clipboard tight. That clipboard was like her best friend. She carried it everywhere, ready to write down anything she didn't like. Her nose was stuck up high in the air, like she thought she was better than everyone else. If you saw her coming, you'd think, "Uh-oh, here comes trouble." Linda's shoes clicked on the pavement as she got closer. Her face was all scrunched up, like she'd just smelled something bad. Maybe she thought she could sniff out problems from a mile away. She stopped right in front of Sarah's yard and stared at Timmy on his tricycle. Her eyes got narrow, and her lips turned into a thin, grumpy line. Sarah noticed her right away. She put her lemonade down and tilted her head, wondering what Linda wanted now. Timmy kept pedaling, not even noticing the grumpy lady watching him. He was too busy laughing and shouting, "We," as he turned the corner of the driveway. Now, here's the fun part: nobody in Oakwood Hills knew it yet, but Linda had a secret. A big, juicy secret that was hiding behind her mean looks and her silly clipboard. It was the kind of secret that could turn everything upside down. Imagine if you had a box of cookies hidden under your bed, but you told everyone you didn't like sweets. That's what Linda was like, only her secret was way bigger than cookies. And this secret? It was going to make her wish she'd stayed inside her house all day, sipping tea and minding her own business. Sarah leaned back in her chair, still smiling a little. She didn't know everything about Linda yet, but she had a feeling something was off. You see, Sarah wasn't just a regular mom who stayed home and watched her kid play. She was smart, really smart. She had a job once where she worked with numbers and figured out tricky puzzles. That's called being an accountant. But Linda didn't know that. To Linda, Sarah was just that mom with the noisy kid. Oh, how wrong she was about to be. Timmy zoomed past again, his red tricycle flashing in the sunlight. He waved at his mom and shouted, "Look, I'm super fast." Sarah clapped her hands and cheered, "You sure are, buddy." It was such a happy moment. The birds were chirping, the grass was green, and the air smelled like flowers. You'd think nothing could ruin a day like this. But Linda? She had other plans. She tapped her clipboard with her pen, like she was getting ready to start a fight. Her eyes locked on Timmy's tricycle, and you could almost see the wheels turning in her head. She didn't like that tricycle one bit. To her, it wasn't just a toy, it was a problem. Sarah watched Linda from the porch. She could tell something was coming. Linda wasn't the kind of person who just stopped by to say hi. No, she only showed up when she wanted to complain. Last month, she'd yelled at Mr. Johnson down the street because his dog barked too much. The month before that, she told Mrs. Carter her flowers were too bright and broke some HOA rule. Linda loved rules more than anything. She had a big book of them at home, and she'd read it like it was her favorite story. But today, it was Timmy's turn to be in her spotlight. And Sarah? She wasn't going to let Linda ruin their fun without a fight. The neighborhood was quiet for a second, except for the sound of Timmy's tricycle wheels spinning. A little breeze rustled the trees, and a squirrel ran across the lawn. It was one of those perfect moments you wish could last forever. But Linda was about to break the peace. She took a big breath, ready to say something loud and bossy. Sarah crossed her arms and waited. She didn't know exactly what Linda was going to do, but she had a hunch it'd be ridiculous. And she was right, things were about to get silly, and maybe even a little crazy. Here's a little hint: Linda thought she was the queen of Oakwood Hills. She acted like she owned every house, every tree, every blade of grass. But what she didn't know was that her throne was about to fall apart. That secret she was hiding? It was like a big storm cloud waiting to burst. And Timmy's tricycle? It was just the spark to light everything up. Sarah didn't know all the details yet, but she was ready to stand up for her son. She loved Timmy more than anything, and no grumpy HOA lady was going to take away his fun. So, picture this: a happy kid on a tricycle, a mom on a porch, and a bossy lady with a clipboard. It sounds like the start of a funny story, right? Well, it is, but it's also the start of something bigger. Something that'd make everyone in Oakwood Hills talk for weeks. Linda thought she was in charge, but she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. And Timmy? He was just pedaling along, not knowing he was about to be the hero of the day. The sun kept shining, the birds kept singing, and Timmy kept riding. Sarah watched Linda take a step closer, her clipboard raised like a shield. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to be a show. A show that'd leave Linda red-faced and the neighborhood cheering. But don't tell anyone yet. Let's keep the secret going just a little longer. Because this sunny Saturday? It was about to get a whole lot sunnier and a whole lot messy. Linda Grayson was mad, really mad. She stomped up to Sarah's porch like she was on a big mission. Her shoes made loud clacking sounds on the steps, and her voice boomed out, so loud it scared the little birds in the trees. They flew away fast, chirping in a panic. That tricycle is a safety hazard, Linda yelled, pointing at Timmy's shiny red tricycle. It's against HOA Rules Section 12, Paragraph 3. I'm calling 911 if it's not gone in 5 minutes. She held her clipboard tight, like it was proof she was right. Sarah, sitting on her porch, just blinked. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mouth opened a little, like she was too surprised to talk right away. Finally, she said, "It's a tricycle, Linda. He's 8. What's he gonna do, start a riot?" Her voice was calm, but her eyebrows went up high. She looked at Timmy, who was still pedaling around the yard, and then back at Linda. A tricycle? A riot? It didn't make any sense. But Linda didn't care what Sarah said. She wasn't listening, not even a little bit. Her face was red, and her eyes were squinting hard, like she was trying to scare Sarah into agreeing. She pulled her phone out of her pocket so fast it almost fell. With shaky fingers, she punched in 911. When someone answered, Linda started talking loud and fast. "Hello, yes, this is an emergency," she shouted into the phone. "There's reckless behavior going on right now. A kid on a tricycle, it's a neighborhood threat. You need to send someone quick." She kept going, saying big words like danger and rules, like Timmy was riding a monster truck instead of a tiny bike with 3 wheels. Timmy heard Linda's loud voice and slowed down. His tricycle's wheels spun quieter now, and he looked over at his mom with big, confused eyes. He tilted his head, like he was asking, "What's going on?" He didn't understand why this lady was so upset about his fun. He scratched his head and pedaled a little closer to the porch, but he didn't stop completely. He was still a kid, after all, and kids don't like sitting still for long. Sarah shook her head slowly. She put her hands on her hips and watched Linda yell into the phone. She wasn't scared, she was annoyed. Who calls 911 over a tricycle? It was the silliest thing she'd ever heard. But Linda? She thought she was the boss. She thought she was winning this fight. She stood there, chest puffed out, like she'd just saved the whole neighborhood from a big, bad problem. Oh, how wrong she was. Linda had no idea what was coming her way. She didn't know Sarah had a trick hidden up her sleeve, a trick so good it'd make Linda's jaw drop to the ground. See, Sarah wasn't just any mom who stayed home and made cookies. She was special. She used to have a job where she worked with numbers all day. Big numbers, little numbers, tricky numbers, she could figure them all out. She was an accountant, which means she was super smart about money and secrets hidden in papers. Linda didn't know that. To Linda, Sarah was just that lady with the kid who rides too much. But Sarah had been watching things in the neighborhood. She'd been quiet about it, but her brain was always working, like a detective in a mystery book. Linda hung up the phone and crossed her arms. "The police are coming," she said with a big, smug smile. "You'll see. Rules are rules, and I'm in charge here." She tapped her clipboard with her pen, like it was a magic wand that made her the queen. She looked at Timmy and then at Sarah, waiting for them to give up. She thought they'd be scared or mad, but Sarah didn't look scared at all. Sarah's eyes twinkled a little, like she knew something Linda didn't. That made Linda frown. Why wasn't Sarah yelling back? Why wasn't she begging Linda to stop? It didn't feel right to her. Timmy pedaled over to the grass and stopped. He climbed off his tricycle and sat down next to it, crossing his legs. "Mom, why is she so loud?" he asked, his voice small and curious. Sarah smiled at him and said, "Oh, don't worry, Timmy. Some people just like making noise." She patted his head, and he grinned. Then he started pulling up little blades of grass, not worried anymore. Kids are funny like that, they can forget trouble fast. Linda heard what Sarah said and got even madder. "Noise. This isn't about noise. This is about safety," she snapped. "That tricycle could hit someone. It could ruin the sidewalk. It's against the rules." She waved her clipboard in the air, like it was a flag she was proud of. Sarah tilted her head and said, "Linda, it's a tricycle. It's not a race car. Nobody's getting hurt." But Linda shook her head hard. "You don't get it? I'm protecting this neighborhood. You'll thank me later." Sarah didn't say anything back. She just watched Linda with a little smile. That smile made Linda nervous, but she didn't show it. She kept talking, listing all the rules Timmy was breaking. Section 12 says no unsafe toys. Paragraph 3 says no reckless riding. I wrote it down right here. She flipped through her clipboard pages, pointing at words Sarah didn't even care about. Sarah wasn't thinking about rules. She was thinking about something else, something Linda didn't see coming. The air felt heavy now, like when a storm is about to start. The birds were quiet, and the wind stopped blowing. Neighbors started peeking out their windows, wondering why Linda was shouting so much. Mr. Johnson, the guy with the loud dog, leaned on his fence and watched. Mrs. Carter, the lady with the bright flowers, opened her door a crack to listen. Everyone could feel it, something big was happening. Linda thought it was all about her winning, but she was wrong. The real fight hadn't even started yet. Sarah stood up from her chair and stretched her arms. She looked at Linda and said, "You sure you want to call the police over this? You might not like what happens next." Her voice was soft, but it had a sneaky sound to it, like she was hiding a surprise. Linda laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Oh, I'm sure," she said. "You'll see who's right." She thought Sarah was bluffing, like in a game of cards. But Sarah wasn't playing games. She had something real up her sleeve, and Linda was about to find out what it was. Timmy looked up at his mom and whispered, "Are the police really coming?" Sarah nodded and said, "Yep, but don't worry. It's gonna be okay." Timmy shrugged and went back to playing with the grass. He trusted his mom. Sarah always made things okay. But Linda? She didn't trust anyone. She thought she was the smartest person on the street. She thought she'd won already. Oh, boy, was she in for a shock. The tension was building, like when you blow air into a balloon and it's about to pop. Linda stood tall, waiting for the police to show up and prove her right. Sarah stayed calm, watching Linda like a cat watches a mouse. And Timmy? He just sat there, not knowing his tricycle was about to change everything. Linda thought she was in control, but the truth was hiding, ready to jump out and surprise her. This sunny day was about to get a lot more exciting, and Linda had no clue. The minutes went by slowly, like when you're waiting for recess but the clock won't move. Linda stood on Sarah's lawn, smirking with her arms crossed tight. She looked so proud, like she'd just saved the whole world from a giant monster. Her clipboard dangled from one hand, and her nose was still up in the air. She thought she was the big winner here. Sarah, though, didn't look worried at all. She was way too calm, maybe even too calm for someone whose kid was in trouble. She leaned against the porch railing, her arms loose and relaxed. She tilted her head and said, "You sure you want to do this, Linda? Call the cops over a tricycle?" Linda didn't like that question. She puffed out her chest and huffed, like an angry dragon. Rules are rules, she snapped back. You'll thank me when this place isn't a madhouse full of crazy kids on bikes. She kept talking, her voice loud and fast, saying stuff about safety and how the neighborhood needed her to keep it perfect. She waved her hands around, like she was giving a big speech to a crowd. But while she rambled on, something weird happened, something she didn't expect at all. A police car rolled up the street. It came fast, way faster than you'd think for a call about a little tricycle. Its lights weren't flashing, but the car looked serious, with its shiny black and white paint gleaming in the sun. 2 officers climbed out. They were tall and wore dark uniforms with badges that sparkled. Their faces didn't smile, they looked like they meant business. Linda's eyes lit up when she saw them. She waved her arms big and wild, like she was calling them to a party. Officers! Over here, she shouted. Right here. This kid's breaking every rule in the book. She pointed at Timmy, who was sitting on the grass next to his tricycle, playing with a stick. But here's the funny thing, the cops didn't even look at Timmy. Not once. Their eyes didn't go to the tricycle or the yard. Instead, they walked straight toward Linda, their boots thumping on the ground. Step, 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 they didn't stop or turn. Linda's smirk, that big, proud smile she'd been wearing, started to slip away. It was like watching ice melt on a hot day. Her mouth twitched, and her eyebrows scrunched up. What was going on? She'd called them about Timmy, right? So why weren't they looking at him? Sarah watched it all from the porch. She didn't say a word, but her lips curled into a tiny, sneaky smile. She leaned a little harder on the railing, like she was waiting for a show to start. Timmy looked up from his stick and saw the police car. Cool, he said, his eyes wide. He didn't know why they were here, but he liked cars, so he wasn't scared. He waved at the officers, but they didn't wave back. They kept walking toward Linda, slow and steady. Linda tried to talk again. Officers, it's that tricycle, she said, pointing at Timmy again. It's dangerous. It's against the rules. I wrote it down, section 12, paragraph 3. She held up her clipboard, shaking it like it was the most important thing ever. But the cops didn't care about her clipboard. The taller officer, with a shiny badge on his chest, held up one hand. Hold on, ma'am, he said. His voice was deep and calm, like a teacher telling you to sit down. Linda stopped talking, but her mouth stayed open a little, like she didn't know what to say next. The other officer, who had a notebook in his hand, looked at Linda and said, "Are you Linda Grayson?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was strong. Linda blinked fast. "Yes, that's me," she said, nodding. "I'm the one who called you. It's about this kid and his tricycle." She tried to sound bossy again, like she was still in charge. But the officers didn't nod or smile. They just stared at her, and the air felt heavy, like before a big rain. Sarah's smile got a tiny bit bigger. She didn't move from the porch, but her eyes sparkled, like she knew a secret joke. Linda didn't notice Sarah's face, she was too busy looking at the cops. Her hands started to shake a little, and she hugged her clipboard closer. Why weren't they yelling at Timmy? Why were they looking at her like that? Her brain was spinning, trying to figure it out, but she couldn't. Something was wrong, really wrong. The neighbors were watching now, too. Mr. Johnson peeked over his fence, his dog barking quietly behind him. Mrs. Carter opened her door all the way and stepped onto her porch, holding a glass of water. Even little Jenny from across the street stopped jumping rope to stare. Everyone could feel it, something big was about to happen. Linda thought the cops were here to back her up, to tell Sarah and Timmy to stop breaking her precious rules. But the cops weren't acting like her friends. They were acting different. Timmy stood up and brushed the grass off his shorts. "Mom, are they here for me?" he asked, his voice small. Sarah shook her head and said, "Nope, buddy. Just watch." She sounded so sure, like she knew exactly what was coming. Timmy shrugged and sat back down, picking up his stick again. He wasn't worried, his mom said it was okay, so it must be okay. But Linda? She was starting to sweat. Her forehead got shiny, and her smirk was totally gone now. The taller officer took a step closer to Linda. He didn't say anything yet, but his eyes were locked on her. Linda swallowed hard, like her throat was dry. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice wobbling a little. I called you about the tricycle. Why aren't you doing anything? She sounded confused and maybe a tiny bit scared. The officer with the notebook flipped a page and started reading something to himself. Linda couldn't see what it said, but it made her stomach twist into knots. Sarah tapped her fingers on the railing, still calm as could be. She didn't yell or laugh, she just waited. She knew something Linda didn't, and that something was getting closer every second. The police car's engine made a soft hum in the background, and the sun kept shining, bright and happy. But the happy day was turning into a puzzle, and Linda was missing the pieces. Linda tried one more time. Officers, please. That kid's breaking the rules. Do your job, she said, pointing at Timmy again. But the cops didn't move toward him. The taller one finally spoke. Ma'am, we need to talk to you, he said. His voice was firm, like when your teacher says you're in trouble. Linda's eyes got wide. Me, she squeaked. Why me? The neighbors leaned closer, trying to hear. Sarah's smile stayed small and secret. Timmy poked at the dirt with his stick. And Linda? She stood there, frozen, as the cops closed in. Her big plan was falling apart, and she didn't even know why yet. But she was about to find out, and it was going to be a doozy. The tall officer held up his hand, like a teacher telling everyone to be quiet. Linda Grayson, he asked, his voice deep and serious. Linda blinked fast, her head bobbing up and down. Yes, that's me, she said, sounding all mixed up. I called about the tricycle. She pointed at Timmy again, like she still thought that was the big problem here. But the officer shook his head quick. We're not here for that, he said, cutting her off before she could finish. His words hit like a big surprise. We've got a warrant. You're under arrest for embezzling HOA funds over $20,000 missing, traced right back to you. He said it plain and loud, so everyone nearby could hear. Linda's mouth fell open wide, like a fish gasping for water. Her eyes got huge, and her face went pale for a second. Then crash, her clipboard slipped right out of her shaky hands. It hit the ground hard, making a loud clatter that echoed in the quiet yard. She didn't even try to pick it up. She just stood there, frozen, like she couldn't believe what she'd heard. $20,000. Missing. Arrest. Her brain was spinning like a top, and she didn't know what to do. Sarah stepped forward from the porch, her sneakers quiet on the grass. A little grin pulled at her lips, like she'd been waiting for this moment all day. She crossed her arms and looked right at Linda. Oh, did I forget to mention, she said, her voice soft but sneaky. I'm not just a stay-at-home mom. I'm an accountant. Been auditing the HOA books for weeks. Guess who tipped off the cops? She tilted her head and smiled bigger, letting the words sink in. Linda's head snapped toward Sarah. Her eyes got even wider, if that was possible. You, she squeaked, her voice all high and wobbly. You did this. She couldn't believe it. Sarah, the quiet mom with the lemonade and the kid on the tricycle, was the one who'd caught her? Linda's face started turning red, redder than a tomato, redder than Timmy's shiny tricycle. She looked like she wanted to yell, but no words came out. Her mouth just opened and closed, like she was trying to catch flies. The neighbors couldn't help themselves now. They peeked out their windows, noses pressed against the glass. Mr. Johnson leaned over his fence so far he almost fell. Mrs. Carter stepped all the way onto her porch, her water glass forgotten in her hand. Little Jenny stopped jumping rope and ran to her front yard to watch. They started whispering to each other, their voices buzzing like bees. Did you hear that? Linda took money. Sarah's an accountant. The whole neighborhood was waking up, and everyone wanted to know more. Timmy, though, didn't care about the grown-up stuff. He climbed back on his tricycle and started pedaling again, zooming around the yard. He shouted, his little legs going fast. He didn't know what embezzling meant, and he didn't care. To him, this was just another fun day outside. He rode past Linda, not even looking at her, his tricycle wheels spinning like nothing was wrong. But Linda? She was a mess. Her big plan to get Timmy in trouble had flipped upside down, and she'd done it to herself. The tall officer pulled out a pair of shiny handcuffs. They jingled a little as he held them up. Ma'am, we need you to come with us, he said, stepping closer to Linda. The other officer, the one with the notebook, started reading something from a paper. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, his voice steady. Linda shook her head fast. "No, no, this is a mistake," she cried. "I didn't do anything. It's that tricycle, it's the problem." She pointed at Timmy again, like she could still blame him. But the cops didn't listen. They'd heard that kind of talk before. The tall officer took Linda's arm gently but firmly. "Let's go," he said. Linda yanked her arm back, but it didn't work. She was stuck. Her face was so red now it looked like it might pop. "You can't do this," she yelled. "I'm the HOA president. I make the rules." But the officers didn't care about her rules. They had bigger rules, laws, and Linda had broken them. Sarah watched it all with that little grin still on her face. She'd been so quiet before, just letting Linda yell and boss everyone around. But now, she was the star. She'd been checking the HOA books for weeks, looking at all the money that was supposed to be there. She found holes, big ones. Money for new playground swings. Gone. Cash for fixing the sidewalks. Missing. And every trail led back to Linda. Sarah had papers, numbers, and proof. She'd called the police yesterday, not today, and told them everything. Linda calling 911 about the tricycle? That just made it funnier. She'd brought the cops right to her own doorstep without even knowing it. Timmy pedaled over to his mom and stopped. "Why's she so mad?" he asked, looking at Linda. Sarah laughed a little and ruffled his hair. "Oh, she's just surprised, buddy," she said. "She didn't know I was so good at finding secrets." Timmy grinned. "Like a spy?" he asked. Sarah winked. "Something like that," she said. Timmy giggled and rode off again, happy as could be. Linda's voice got louder. "This isn't fair," she shouted as the officers turned her around. The handcuffs clicked onto her wrists, click, click, and she stomped her foot. "I was keeping this place safe. You'll all be sorry." But nobody looked sorry. Mr. Johnson smirked from his fence. Mrs. Carter shook her head and sipped her water. Jenny clapped her hands, like it was a fun game. The neighbors weren't on Linda's side anymore. They were tired of her bossy ways, and now they knew she'd been sneaky, too. The tall officer started walking Linda to the police car. Her shoes dragged on the ground, like she didn't want to go. "I'll fix this," she yelled over her shoulder. "You'll see." But her voice sounded weaker now, like she wasn't so sure. The other officer picked up her clipboard from the grass and tucked it under his arm. It didn't look so important anymore, just a bunch of papers that couldn't help her now. Sarah leaned against the porch railing again, watching Linda get led away. She didn't say anything else, but her eyes were bright. She'd won not with yelling or fighting, but with smarts. Linda thought she was the queen of Oakwood Hills, but Sarah had pulled the rug out from under her. And the best part? Linda had called the cops herself, thinking she'd get Timmy in trouble. Instead, she'd handed herself right over. It was like a big, funny trap she didn't even see. The police car door opened with a creak. Linda had to duck her head to get in, her red face disappearing behind the window. The neighbors kept whispering, and Timmy kept riding. The sun shone down like nothing had changed, but everything had. Linda's big day of being the boss was over, and Sarah's secret had turned it all around. What a twist. The officers put shiny handcuffs on Linda's wrists, click, click, and she couldn't wiggle free. She kept talking fast, her voice all shaky. "This is a mistake," she cried. "I'm the victim here. You've got it all wrong." But the cops didn't listen. They had proof, super strong proof that didn't lie. Sarah had found it all, bank papers showing money was gone, fake receipts Linda made up, and lots more. Sarah's sharp eyes missed nothing, and now Linda was caught. The tall officer held Linda's arm and walked her to the police car. She glared at Sarah with mean, squinty eyes, like she wanted to yell something nasty. But Sarah? She just smiled and waved, nice and sweet, like she was saying goodbye to a friend. Linda's face got even redder, but she couldn't do anything about it. The cops opened the car door, and she had to sit down inside. The door shut with a loud thump, and that was that. A few days later, something big happened. Everyone in Oakwood Hills went to an HOA meeting. It was in the community room, where they all sat in chairs and talked about neighborhood stuff. Sarah stood up front, holding a stack of papers. She started telling